All right, so let's talk a little bit more about um, salt toxicity. I recently been working on a project where your lab actually did some data. I don't know if you're in the loop on it. The Cowboys, do you see any of their paperwork, or are you more ag?
I get called when usually people have trouble, our distributors, or I'm in charge of all of our education this winter. So that's no.
So he's got a real unique situation. I love Chris, and hopefully I'll get him on the show at some point in the future.
Oh, the Cowboys. You mean the Cowboys, like the football?
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Yes, I know the project. Yes.
All
Sorry.
right.
And just Cowboys in general. No, I don't know.
So yeah, he's got the most incredibly tough job. He transitioned out of synthetics. He started transitioning out of synthetics many years ago. I met him, I think it was between 3 and 4 years ago. He sent me off a Haney report indicating that he had zero protozoa and that he was really struggling to get his nutrient cycling system up and running. He was working with a wonderful mycologist, good friend of mine, Efren, to better understand how to get mycorrhizae to associate with his plants, because he really wanted to push away from the synthetics completely. He's in a really tough situation. It's engineered soil, so 99% sand, 1% organic matter. When I met him, he was scared to death of organic matter because that turns the field mushy. But as I explained to him, I go, look, without some form of organic matter, you can't get to the next level with saprophytic fungi and protozoa and all the other soil food web constituents. And so we worked, I'd say probably about a year, really started to turn the field around, and something happened. They had to rip up all the sod, did it again. He recolonized it, was back up to a sweet level. Then he had to rip out the center of the field because the GM didn't like the way the turf looked. Brought in all synthetic turf, plugged it into a biological system, and turned a big brown shit stripe right down the middle of the field. Then they ripped up the whole field again, resodded the whole thing, and started over again. So this has been like, this roller coaster ride with him, and trying to establish a complete soil food web community in something that keeps getting ripped up. On top of that, he's forced to use reclaimed water, which has got incredibly high levels of salt, chloride, and all of these other potentially, pharmaceuticals, et cetera, et cetera. And then on top of all that, this field is surrounded by glass buildings. So think of a magnifying glass. Right. You walk out into that field and you're like, oh God, that hurts. So he's fighting everything. And part of the big issue we had with the last go around was he did a flush. This was a product that was 3 different products that were all, 2 of them were told or sold as surfactants, and 1 was sold as a humic acid. And so we did SAP. Was August 19th, 10/17. No, it was 8/19, 10/17. No, so it would have been before that. Anyway, we did 3 series of SAPs, and we did 2 series of tissue. And what we noticed was the chlorides and the salts were through the roof in the tissue, and still pretty high in the sap. But it was like, where is that threshold where you've got so much salt that you're actually going toxic? And how do you regulate that when you're dealing with such a harsh condition and no real way to mitigate it? Do you have any suggestions for that?
Yeah, that's hard.
Right.
Yeah, that's hard. So I'm kind of assuming that there's hard water involved too. High bicarbonates.
Yep.
That's really going to tie up your calcium and your magnesium, and so that's problematic. So chlorides, so high chlorides and sodium, those are easiest for the plants to take up. They're -1 for chloride, negative or +1 for for sodium.
Mhm.
And so, I mean, in a cropping system, increasing your other macrocations and macroanions, and that's a lot of money. I mean, quite frankly, to outcompete that. Humic is great. Love humic. But gosh, that is, if you're seeing amazing amount of sodium toxicity, I'm wondering if you have potassium deficiency, because they usually go hand in hand. Of that's usually the case.
I I think he has high potassium, which was
High
yeah,
potassium and high salt, but no
uh,
calcium.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Okay. So no calcium means that the plants are really weak, unfortunately, when you have very little cellular structure. So plants will continue to grow. They're pretty cool. They can use other nutrients in cell walls if they're not using the correct building materials, but it makes the cell walls really weak. Just like if the plant doesn't have a micronutrient, it will use a different micronutrient, and that process will become very energy inefficient.
Mm.
So, utilizing different macronutrients for in cell walls instead of calcium is very troubling, because it makes weak leaves. They burn easily. The tips burn. I do not have for gosh, that water. So the water is your biggest input of any cropping, any system at all, is water. If they're going to change anything, to help that water in some way, because that they're putting the most on of that, and that is the most harmful that they're doing the most harm with that water. If they
And
back up everything else, that water is if they're using bad water, they're doing more harm than good.
that's the whole reason we did the flush, was because it had no rain this year, which is unusual. Normally he gets rain, and the rain helps to push the salts, chlorides down further into the soil profile, and make them less available. But he didn't get any rain, and they had an incredibly hot summer. So he was using a tremendous amount of water, almost to the point where we started to see anaerobes. We had a couple of parts southwest and southeast parts of the field that actually showed increased populations of ciliates. And I kept saying, "Hey, look, you're crossing the threshold. You need to calm that water down, or do you have, is the field all pitched in that direction? So when you're watering this half of the field, it's all running down there. Is there a way to mitigate the irrigation? Back off in southeast and southwest, and use more in northeast and northwest." And he's like, "I don't have that type of control over the system." And I go, "All right, well, I think the next